Dobroveče, ovo je prva intervju. Ja sam Anđela Šestović. Moj gost večeras je predavač na odsjeku za međunarodne odnose na prestižnoj Londonskoj školi ekonomije i političkih nauka Univerziteta u Londonu. Čovjek koji je od iste ustanove dobio nagradu za izvrsnost u obrazovanju u prošloj godini. Zamjenik direktora istraživačke grupe G20 zemalja. Prije nego se pridružio čuvenom LSE-u koji je iznjedrio Nobelove laureate i državne lidere svijeta, naš gost bio je profesor politike, kasnije i diplomatskih studija na Univerzitetu Oxford, gdje je proglašen za najistaknutijeg predavača 2016. Nekadašnji je savjetnik u vladi Kanade i oficir u Kanadskoj visokoj komisiji u Londonu. Iskustvo ga preporučuje za eksperta za diplomatiju i vrsnog poznavaoca globalnih prilika o kojima ćemo večeras govoriti. Njegovo ime je Tristan Naylor, a vi ostanite uz Prvu televiziju jer počinjemo razgovor odmah nakon reklama. Evo nas ponovo u studiju, pratite emisiju Prva intervju. Podsjetimo, razgovaramo sa Tristanom Naylorom, predavačem na odsjeku za međunarodne odnose na Londonskoj školi ekonomije i političkih nauka. A povod da započnemo razgovor je posljednje istraživanje gospodina Naylora objavljeno u knjizi Socijalno zatvaranje i internacionalno društvo, a u kojoj se bavi ulogama najmoćnijih zemalja u uspostavljanju međunarodnog reda od 19. vijeka do danas. Mr. Naylor, good evening, and thank you for being our guest. Thank you.
Thank you.
In your last book, you discuss the phenomenon, the theory of social closure. Where is social closure the most dominant today? Examples of which countries impressed you the most? Why did it happen? Why social closure exists in them?
So the theory explains how and why we get clubs of states in international politics, high status groups in the international domain, things like the G7, the G20, the BRICS. It's about select groups of states coming together and forming a little social club, a little social clique, an elite group that differentiates themselves from others and says, we're high status and you're low status. We are special, we get special privileges, and you do not. And so I think we see this across the globe, but particularly with a group like the G20, I think we see social closure, this idea of closing off membership, of closing off opportunity, particularly acutely.
For who is that good and for who is not?
Well, it predominantly privileges those who are already in positions of relative strength and power. The United States, China, the United Kingdom, they are whose positions are most protected by this closing off, by this setting of membership rules and not changing the composition of the club. And it's up-and-coming states, it's rising states, it's middle powers and developing countries who are most disadvantaged because despite economic success, despite further integration in international society, there's no getting into these clubs because the membership is closed. And so you can be on an upward trajectory, but you're still not getting into the elite club.
You named these countries as family of civilized nations, right? Which, as you say, shapes society. How is this done through time?
So the family of civilized nations was a way that Western European countries in the 18th and 19th century referred to themselves. And basically the argument that I'm making in the book is a historical comparison and looking back to particularly 19th century imperialism and colonialism, basically the profound racism of many Western European states seeing themselves as civilized and the rest of the world as barbaric and savage. And that's also a status group. Civilized is high status, barbaric and savage is low status. And if you're civilized, you get to do things that others don't. And so I'm looking at the early 19th century and this discourse of civilization and barbarism and saying that this status game in the 19th century actually doesn't differ that much from the status game being played today. We don't use the discourse of civilization or barbarians and savages. It's not so racist and colonial and imperial, but we're nonetheless still playing a very closed status game where it's between the haves and the have-nots, the economic superpowers and the developing countries, and so on and so forth. So the language has changed, much of the politics have changed, but the type that there is a status game being played with exclusive clubs, that remains the same across a couple hundred years of history.
How to join the club? What are the rules?
That's a great question. So depending on how the status game is played, the rules change. So in this historical example of the 19th century family of civilized nations, again, it was rooted in very racist understandings of what matters and what counts. So to join the family of civilized nations, you had to look like a European state, have adherence to liberal law. You needed predominantly to be white, and so on and so forth. What's interesting over the course of the 19th and particularly then into the early 20th century, a lot of those rules sort of change and are relaxed, largely for the better. But there were a number of states at the time that were trying to join this elite club, but nonetheless were kept out because they didn't meet specific criterion. For example, Japan is, I think, the perfect example of a country in the late 19th century, beginning in 1871, undergoing this massive reformation of their entire society to join the West, join the elite club of Western civilization. They were excluded. Why? Largely for profoundly racist reasons. And this then sets about a chain of events that leads us to Japanese imperialism in the beginning of the 20th century and indeed then the Second World War in the Pacific. That was then. In terms of now, how do you join the club? Well, if we're looking at clubs like the G7 or the G20, it's about being rich. It's about being wealthy. It's about being absolutely central in the global economy, being indispensable to the global economy. And that's some might say a more fair way to establish who is high status and who is not. But it still locks out opportunities for other states that don't count as being, at the top of the economic status hierarchy.
Later, we'll talk about these divisions. Now, more than 30 years have been passed since the end of Cold War, or as some say, beginning of Cold Peace. Back then, the American American political scientist Francis Fukuyama declared the triumph of liberal democracy over undemocratic totalitarian regimes. And that moment he called the end of the history. He wanted to say that we have found the best possible social order. What do you think? Was it true? And do we have, let's say, return to history today?
Well, poor Professor Fukuyama really got beaten up quite badly for the title of a book that he himself didn't really choose. It was more his publishers choosing this fantastic title that would sell loads and loads of books. So I have a great deal of sympathy for Professor Fukuyama. His argument was that there was no longer a grand alternative to liberal capitalism. With the fall of communism in the former Soviet Union, that was it. Liberal capitalism was the only game in town. We're at the end of history. That doesn't mean that events aren't going to happen, that there's not going to be challenges to this order, but there's not going to be some rival system put in place. That was the argument. We, as you point out, have had 30 years now to sort of test this thesis. And I think what we're seeing now is really, really interesting across the world, where it seems that capitalism still seems to be holding on pretty well entrenched, even in remaining communist countries. You cannot deny that China's incredible economic success comes from the adoption of a capitalist system and participation in capital markets. But it's liberalism, it's that liberal half of the liberal capitalist equation that I think we're seeing eroding, whether in former Soviet countries. Indeed, we're seeing it eroding at a shockingly quick pace in the United States itself. And so I think Fukuyama is right and he's wrong. He's right in that there doesn't seem to be a rival system that's come up. Loads of opposition to that system, but no sort of grand alternative to capitalism. But where he was wrong, or maybe not as right as he would like to be, is we see liberalism sort of crumbling, not from outside, but from within.
Interesting.
And that if there is one big world-defining phenomenon that we have observed over the past, say, 4 or 5 years, I think it's that.
Interesting view. Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, when signing in 1990 Paris Charter, set out a vision of a common European home, and in which everyone would share the same sense of security. Then he declared the divisions as a thing of the past. But when we look at the present, it seems that there has never been more divisions in the world, and it has never been deeper than today. Political, military, West, East, racial, gender, religious divisions. Why did it come to that?
Oh, I wish I knew. It's a big question. But my speculative answer to a very big question is this, or my tentative answer to a big question is this. The optimism with which Gorbachev spoke, indeed the optimism that really populated political discourse in the late 80s and particularly the early 90s, sold this promise of globalization, of the coming together of the entire world through stronger trade links and political links and whatnot. That was the discourse of the particularly the early 90s. And what we've seen, especially in the past, I think, 20 years, and even more acutely in the past 10 since the global financial crisis, is that this promise, this optimism, wasn't evenly shared by all. There was a great deal of faith invested in this idea of everything getting better for everyone through closer links, through globalization and all that it had to offer. But we see globalization, or we've seen globalization benefit a great number of people, but disproportionately, we see the building of an incredibly elite, an incredibly rich and powerful elite, and the benefits that they enjoy are not enjoyed broadly across populations. And I think it's this, this is what fuels populist politics across the world today. and particularly the Western and former Soviet bloc areas of the world. I think that to put it as succinctly as possible, if succinctly at all, this is what we've seen happen. That promise, that optimism, really didn't bear out, and we're seeing a reaction and anger to it not playing out evenly for all.
We can hardly imagine President Putin uttering a sentence such the one that Gorbachev used. But a German politician, Horst Telzig, once said that NATO, Europe, and the United States should call on Putin to sit down and reach an agreement. Can you imagine such an agreement being made? Can we expect in the future all these leaders of the strongest countries to sit around the table and to commit themselves to overcome divisions?
Well, I certainly hope so. But I think that if we take a survey of the international diplomatic landscape today, it's not likely, and it's not likely in the near term. Simply put, the leaders that you see around the proverbial table are very much oriented towards their national politics. And this is just not a moment for President Putin, for President Trump. This is not a moment in which we can envisage figures like President Putin or President Trump saying, we're going to put down our national pride and we're going to sit as equals and talk and sort of hammer something out such that we have a reduction in tensions. I just don't see it happening. The G20 is an opportunity for that to happen every year. It's an annual event. We haven't seen that happening, and we're not going to see it this year when Riyadh hosts it online in November. I don't think we're going to see it next year either. But there's an American election coming, so maybe that'll change things. It's tough to say. Mm-hmm.
The theme of G20 summit to be held in November is chances for 21st century. You just said that we cannot expect that kind of deal, as I said before, but what we can expect, and where do you see chances for 21st century?
Well, I think that if you were asking that question to me or anybody involved in, say, the G20 exactly a year ago, they would have a very different answer to what they have today. Simply put, the global pandemic has really thrown everything off course, not just in terms of health security, but also the global economic crisis that it has ushered in has thrown the agenda into relative disarray. And simply put, any big signature initiatives that the Saudi government or any other G20 member wanted to discuss a year ago at the G20 is pretty much off the table right now, because there really are only two issues that really matter for global stability: COVID and the economic crisis. And it's not so much about planning for the future, although this is part of it. Really, right now, it's about crisis management. How do we get ourselves out of these twin entangled crises?
Certainly. We'll talk about pandemic a little bit later. I would love to talk a little bit more about divisions and to ask you, what do you think? How much did NATO and its expansion to the East influence divisions in the world? We know that numerous US leaders, officials, senators, and military experts warned Bill Clinton in an open letter in 1990s that expanding forces to the East could strengthen the undemocratic opposition and weaken reform forces. Were these warnings justified?
They certainly seem to be, based on what we've witnessed over the past 7-10 years now. NATO, I think what we're seeing there is in part this story of the optimism of the mid-90s sort of getting ahead of itself. And there was this idea that the Cold War is over. It's all right if NATO expands eastwards. What could be the harm? We're all we're all friends now. And I think the speed with which this happened and the particular way in which it happened really shot the defensive posture, particularly on the part of the Kremlin. And I think quite unsurprisingly so. And so what we've seen is there's nothing problematic with NATO in and of itself, but what was missed was a realization that, like in physics, any action has an equal and opposite reaction, and of course, with the spread of NATO eastwards, this garnered a very profound security reaction on the part of Russia. This is not to justify what that reaction was or has been, but rather to say, I think that if we take a step back as analysts, we can understand it.
Sure. We already see what is happening with Huawei, with the establishment of 5G network in the world. Can we expect future wars over technology as we had over the oil?
Whether or not we have wars over technology is
like no real wars, but like divisions, more divisions.
Yeah, something an interesting question I ask my students every single year is, do you think we're far away from the next war? And something that I think is really, really interesting is in the past 2 years, I don't see hands clearly going up and saying yes or no, but rather say we're already in it. And I think that's really, really fascinating because this idea that in cyberspace, there is a war raging, and it is a fundamentally different one from the territorially based war fought with armies and tanks and planes and bombs and guns than we understand, that we know, that we're familiar with. And so will there be a war fought over technology? Yes, no, maybe. But will there be a war fought with technology? Unquestionably. And I think what's quite interesting, we may already be in it.
How do you comment on the American president's proposal to expand the list of G7 countries and to include Russia, India, Australia, and Korea? Will his request be granted?
I think it's a terrible idea. And will it be granted? I think it's unlikely. So there's the short answer. The longer answer is this. One, the G7, to the extent that it remains relevant, and I'm not entirely sure it's as relevant as the G7 likes to pretend it is, but to the extent that it is, it's because they are a small, close-knit group of liberal, Western-oriented democracies and economies. That's what binds them together. When you begin admitting members that don't fit that profile, then the group no longer has the cohesion that allows it to be effective to the extent that it is. Particularly given this list of countries, it's pretty much just sort of the G20, but countries that the American president happens to like. And that also is not a good reason to cobble together a group. It's not clear then how this new Donald Trump version of the G7 would really be significantly different from the G20.
Probably
so
he wants to exclude China in some way, right?
I mean, it's actually quite naked and obvious what's going on here. Yeah. And simply put, if a group like that is going to have authority and any degree of efficacy in international politics, it cannot be just a group that is created at the whim of any particular leader. It needs to be independent of a particular leader or a particular state. It can't just be some sort of puppet tool of the United States. It loses all standing, all authority if it is such, or if it's even perceived as such. I just do not see the other G7 leaders saying, sure, let's throw open the membership doors, and why don't you invite everybody who's your friend, Donald? It's not going to happen.
Maybe one day. Not so close future, maybe 50 years, yeah. Do you think that America's global position has weakened? And how will the upcoming US elections affect America's role in the world?
Again, two very big questions. Has America's position weakened? Yes, unquestionably in innumerable ways. And again, what I think is really interesting here is that the position hasn't weakened because of some outside force, or at least in a traditional sense, some sort of outside force, nor has it really weakened because other countries have gotten stronger at some sort of rate that they weren't already growing. Rather, it's gotten weaker because internal divisions in America have caused it to fall apart. We can debate whether or not those divisions were already there, but what's certain is they have been exposed, and they are tearing apart America internally, and really, in terms of foreign policy, undermining American foreign policy in a litany of different ways. And this is the sort of thing that, for an international relations scholar like me, is one, fascinating, but two, terrifying, because this is a crumbling of established order from within. And this is sort of one of those things where we kind of do throw up our hands and go, I'm not sure what's next, but it's probably not good. Mm-hmm. In terms of your second question, what will the election do? Well, one, it obviously depends on the outcome. But let's imagine that Joe Biden is elected president. My great concern is that the damage that has been done in not just the past 4 years, but indeed the damage that has been done pretty much in the last 20, is such that there's no coming back from that. I think that it's quite easy and accurate to critique the Trump administration's foreign policy for diminishing America's standing in the world, but to a lesser degree, the Obama administration, and certainly we must not forget the Bush administration, did a great deal to send America on this downward trajectory. So what I see Trump as being somebody who has accelerated this decline, but not somebody who has started it. And because this is a broader historical trend, I do not think that the election of Joe Biden or the election of anybody is somehow going to reverse America's fortunes. Mm-hmm.
Can you compare the implications of potential Trump's victory versus Biden's victories on Europe and the Western Balkans?
Oof. Well, I think that if President Donald Trump gets another term in office, I think there will be very few limitations on his power at that point. So the things that he has been pushing for, not just in Western Europe, not just in the Balkans, but globally, that he has not been able to achieve, I think those handcuffs, those fetters will come off, and he'll be able to get them. So we're going to see sort of the America First agenda ramped up to 11 on the dial. It's going to be its fullest extent. And again, this is quite an order-defining moment, not just for America, but for the world if that happens.
Mm-hmm. The director of the German Institute for Foreign Policy, Eberhard Sennschneider, believes that continuation of American-Chinese conflict could lead to the end of globalization as we know it today, and that it could be the beginning of Cold War between two countries. What do you think? Is it real?
It certainly could be the end of globalization as we know it. It won't be the end of globalization. I don't think
sure.
That you can flick the switch. I think sort of we're on a trajectory, and quite which way globalization twists and turns is up for grabs. And this is a moment where actually we could see a big turn in quite what globalization means, or we might actually see a divergence where we end up with sort of a Western American-led globalization, or global order, and maybe a Chinese version of globalization and global order. And we might end up with sort of this bifurcated international system, not unlike we saw during the Cold War. Obviously fought in different terms and by different means, but again, two discrete global orders, two discrete centers of power, and a bit of a, well, actually more than a bit of a standoff. If the trade dispute continues, I rate that as being very, very likely.
Let's now talk about Europe, a little bit closer to us. What kind of European Union will Chancellor Angela Merkel leave behind? At the end of the year, German presidency of the European Union ends. That's the reason why I ask.
I think it's likely that she'll leave behind one that is in a stronger position than it was a year ago, or certainly 2 years ago. The reason for this, I think, is twofold. One, Britain leaving the European Union and no longer being able to play a spoiler role. I mean, Britain has now left, we're in the transition period, but no more resource needs to be directed towards the negotiation of the future trade agreement, should it be concluded within the year, and I am skeptical of that. But one, Britain is out and no longer able to play a spoiler role in European politics. And two, this is yet another moment of crisis for the European Union, now wrestling with the coronavirus crisis, in addition to another economic crisis, and indeed still the question of migration into Europe. But out of moments of crises, these are moments for resilience to be built in institutions, and I think this is what we're seeing in the European Union. Things are a bit shaky right now, things are a bit up in the air, but I think the groundwork is certainly being laid right now, such that as Europe emerges out of these crises, as the whole Brexit thing is finally done, what we're going to see is actually a more cohesive, stronger European Union. And I do think for Germany, for France, for the remaining European Union states, that is a good thing.
Has the EU unity been shaken by pandemic? What do you think? What is the future of the community?
So I think that in some ways we did see, particularly early on, some national divisions emerging. This was particularly so, I think we saw this particularly acutely in March and April. But I think in the months since, we've seen that rhetoric die down to the extent that it was really ever prevalent at all. And I'm just not seeing those divisions in terms of public health and COVID, and the discourse with respect to COVID generally falling around nationalist lines. So I don't think that it's something that's tearing the union apart. I think other things are, but not COVID.
What is the future of the Western Balkans? To whom it will belong?
Well, ideally, the Western Balkans will belong to the Western Balkans, and the Western Balkans won't be the plaything of Russia, of Western Europe, of America. But again, we find ourselves in this moment of flux. We find ourselves in a moment of uncertainty, if not instability. And so it really is tough to say. What I think is important to note is to really emphasize that the political decisions that are made right now will have outsized effects in the future. The political decisions that are made in Moscow, in Washington, in Brussels, in any Balkan capital will determine the future in a more significant way than decisions made, say, a year or two ago, because we're in this moment of flux, of uncertainty.
Mr. Naylor, we will continue our conversation. After a few minutes, we are going to set off advertisements. Ponovo smo u studiju, privodimo kraju razgovor sa Tristanom Naylorom, profesorom međunarodnih odnosa na LSE-u. Mr. Naylor, the United Nations has repeatedly addressed that the pandemic will deepen the already existing problems, poverty, climate changes, migrations. What three lessons should humanity learn from COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, first and foremost, that the great global challenges that the world faces, the challenges that really do threaten the survival of humanity, do not recognize global borders. The great challenges we face don't care about petty politics. They don't care about partisanship. Things like pandemic disease, things like climate change, doesn't care. It's indifferent to our human dramas. And what COVID, what climate change has to tell us if we're going to make it through is that we need to put particularist nationalist politics to the side if we're going to make it through, if we're going to survive the next 50, the next 100 years. And I don't want to be a doomsayer, but we are facing, maybe not with COVID, but certainly with climate change, we are facing a very serious existential crisis that is about to dramatically transform our entire world in every way conceivable. And so if there's something to be taken from COVID, from this experience of a global pandemic, it's that the way we conduct our politics and the way that we think about who we are and how we survive has to change, and it has to change very quickly.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, to what extent and in what direction will world change after this crisis?
Well, one great fear that I have is that it won't change that much. I think when we're in a moment of crisis, we tend to overestimate the extent to which things will change. And my great fear is that we're going to come out of this and actually not much changes. We've got some vaccines, we wash our hands more, maybe we wear masks a little more often, and we're a little more sensitive when we get a sore throat. That, my great worry is that's going to be the extent of our change. We're not going to see grand political, societal, and social change where we say, no, we have to do things differently because we are living in a global interconnected world where the threats that we face can't be solved by nationalist politics. That's my great worry. So how do I think it's going to change? I fear not much.
I hope that life will get better soon, but that we will use to live with these kind of things.
I sincerely hope things change soon too. I'm very, very tired of being stuck in the same room every day. I miss seeing people.
The pandemic has also shown the importance of new technologies, and that we must not rely on solely one branch of the economy rather than on our own production. What do you think? How to boost the economy of such a small country as Montenegro is? We are dependent on tourism, you know.
Yeah, and something that COVID has shown from the very beginning of the pandemic is that a country that is so articulated towards just one single segment of the economy, in this case tourism, is as vulnerable as you can possibly imagine when there is some global shock. And again, whether it's a global pandemic, whether it's climate change, when there are these great shocks that just throw everything into disarray, if you're reliant on people coming in and spending money and staying in hotels and enjoying your wonderful restaurants, you're in big trouble. And so I think the way out is not to just suddenly transform an economy overnight. That's not going to happen. But rather to be looking into the future, looking at the challenges of the future and beginning investing in those challenges. I think the most obvious one is green energy and planning for a post-oil future. You don't need to be a Gulf state to be the next energy superpower. You can develop expertise in solar technologies, in wind technologies, in pretty much any renewable technology. And investing in that is not only going to reduce economic dependence on one segment of the economy, tourism, but it's also going to be the fuel, to excuse the pun, of the future. And it's investing in sort of almost these moonshot ideas of where's the world heading in 20 years? We want to be there before everybody else. We want to grow the expertise to be the world's solar power, wind power, battery power, superpower.
Can you comment on recent parliamentary elections in Montenegro? Do you know which results were? Can you?
I'm afraid I can't. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on the politics of Montenegro.
Okay, then we'll talk next time about it, right?
Happily next time.
Okay. What do you think? What is the potential scale of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
I think it's likely to remain a regional conflict. I'm hesitant to say that it's unlikely to be a long, drawn-out conflict. Anybody who's ever made that prognostication on TV has proven to be pretty wrong. So I don't want to make that, but I would be very surprised if this spills out into being a broader conflict than it already is.
Mr. Naylor, what are you currently working on? Are you working on a new book or?
I am, and what I'm interested in right now is looking at how theatrical, performative practices in politics shapes international politics. So at things like international summits, how all these things like the playing of anthems and the sending up of flags and the handshakes and the photos of leaders together, these are seen as just sort of diplomatic niceties that don't really affect our political world. But what I'm writing on right now and what the next book is going to be about is actually how these performances, these little set pieces of theater, have a profound effect on politics. And indeed, this is one of those cases where the American president is quite useful here. Here is a man who is a reality TV game show host who has become the most powerful person in the world. Now, the American president, I think it's all right for me to say, it's more than fair for me to say, doesn't know a lot about many things. But one thing that he does know a great deal about is showmanship and how to produce a bit of stage theater. And he is very good at that. And I think that he's not actually exceptional in the international domain. I think that whether we're talking about the Russian president or certainly the British prime minister, they bring a sense of showmanship and theater to international public performances that has a profound effect on shaping what happens at summits, has a profound effect on shaping who is allied with whom, and so on and so forth. So that's the next project.
Mr. Naylor, we wish you a lot of luck. And it was a pleasure to talk with you, to have you here as our guest. Hope to see you in live one day.
I too, and I'm honored much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Poštovani gledaoci, bio je to Tristan Naylor, ekspert za međunarodne odnose i diplomatiju, predavač na Londonskoj školi ekonomije. Razgovor je realizovan uz podršku Ljetne škole diplomatije Gavro Vuković, kojima se ovom prilikom zahvaljujemo. I vama, dragi gledaoci, hvala što ste bili uz našu televiziju. Laku noć.